In the mainline Pokemon games, you usually fight your rival immediately after receiving your starter Pokemon. This fight is typically intended to be the tutorial battle, where the basic mechanics of dealing damage and winning fights are explained to the assumedly new player. The language and styling is deliberately geared towards a younger player with no outside experience of battling or Pokemon generally. I don't disagree with this decision in principle, and I think that the games explaining themselves clearly to new players is ultimately a good thing, as I have said in the past. What's interesting to me is how these battles have changed over time, from being a tedious slog of a fight to doing a great job at explaining the game to newer players. I think the first 4 generations of Rival 1 fights are genuinely awful, for several reasons, most of which are at least fixed or made significantly better by the time we come to the Switch games. Let's get into it. In my mind, having a rival fight right at the start of the game has 2 main purposes: introducing the player to battling, and setting up the rival as a recurring character who you will encounter throughout the game. On these grounds, I can't really give any of them a failing grade, since they all do this in some shape or form. I know afterwards that battling is a thing that Pokemon trainers do competitively for money, and that I'm going to see this person, who I had to name, again in combat. But my main issue is how the games go about this. Not all Rival 1 fights are made equal after all, and some are much better than others, but we'll get to that. Let's go back to the very beginning in Red and Blue. As in most games, except Yellow and its remakes Let's Go, you have 3 options for a starter, 2 of which have Growl. If you pick Charmander, life is easy, but otherwise you're stuck in a fight with 2 options: Tackle or Scratch, and either Tail Whip or Growl. Growl is the problem. Growl turns what should be a casual 4 to 5 turn affair into a slog that can result in dealing 1 damage a turn for Pokemon with between 18 and 22 HP. If you're using Squirtle, you can avoid this by tail whipping twice, which guarantees at least 2 damage a turn, but otherwise it can be incredibly painful and slow. You have no other Pokemon to swap, no healing items, and no other strategies, meaning losing is very much possible. Bash yourself into the other Pokemon until one of you dies and the other claims a hollow victory. This fight ranges from just okay when it's 4 to 5 turns and unbearable when it lasts 12 to 15. This fight is a good example of what turns some people away from Pokemon. It's a turn-based RPG with early fights that can feel incredibly tedious. The number of people who don't play Pokemon and say they tried it out but stopped because they got bored is high in my experience, and they often complain about how slow the early game can feel. Fights like this do not help. The basic concept of a hook in any form of fictional material is important for bringing people in and keeping their attention. Red and Blue actually do a good job of this before the fight, I think, with Oak stopping you from leaving town and giving you this cool pet, and even getting challenged to a fight before you can leave the lab is pretty sweet. It's snappy, it's a good introduction, and it gets you hyped for the fight, only for it to turn into a total slogfest that kills any kind of early momentum. This isn't helped by the wild encounter lottery that follows on your way to and from Viridian City as you collect Oak's mail. The main issue I see with this is that it doesn't exactly give the player any hints about the variety or nuance of Pokemon battling. Instead, it just seems like a really bland battle simulator with zero flavor to it. There's 2 pictures on screen and they're hitting each other over and over, and at this point in time, that's all they can do. Things get better once you escape the lab with your Pokédex and can actually go and buy some balls to catch some other Pokemon, but some people who might otherwise enjoy the games but maybe are impatient about starting them might have given up by now. If Pokemon battling could be really fun, you wouldn't have any clue from the first 10 minutes of the game. Unfortunately, this scenario is pretty much rinse and repeat until we get to Generation 5. Generation 2 has you fighting your rival while completing the errand, which is a nice change, and getting stopped on your way back adds some nice tension, especially with the anonymous stranger angle. Unfortunately, the fight suffers from the same problems as Generation 1, barring that your starter has a Berry Held item, making defeat significantly less likely. Generation 3's fight is much the same, with no errand to complete beyond just going and fighting the rival. It does the same things well that Generations 1 and 2 do, and suffers from the same problems. I have a real problem with Generation 4's fight, and I think depending on your starter, it can be the worst of all of them. If you happen to pick Piplup, you will end up fighting Turtwig, who the developers in their galaxy-brained wisdom decided to give Withdraw. While this has the same effect of reducing the damage you do each turn, Piplup's lower attack and Turtwig's higher defense make it feel extra slow. This is not at all assisted by Diamond and Pearl's uber-slow battle engine, which makes turns feel glacial. So you can't really deal any damage because the penguin is weak and the turtle is bulky, and it can just sit there and buff defense until the cows come home, and the turns take an eternity. It's so unbelievably boring and frustrating to play, it almost stops me every time I start a new save file in these games. Thankfully, the battle engine got a bit faster in Platinum, but it's still not great because of Withdraw. In Generation 5, the fights turn a corner, things are looking up. All of the starters now have a defense lowering status move like Lair or Tail Whip rather than an attack lowering status move like Growl. This, combined with the fact that Tackle's accuracy was buffed to 100%, means that it is impossible for the fight to become a long, drawn-out slogfest that makes you want to put down the console and pick it up after waiting 6 to 12 business months. It's still not perfect, since it is a run-of-the-mill, smash into each other until the other dies type affair, but at least it's over quickly. Tackle's power was also buffed in this generation, meaning you just deal a lot more damage each turn. If I were making suggestions to try and fix these earlier fights, I would make two small changes. The first is simple. In the games where the fight takes place while the player goes to complete some kind of errand, let them catch Pokémon while they're out doing it. In most games where this takes place, for example Crystal or Emerald, the player is unable to catch any Pokémon, as the Pokemarts that are accessible have had their Pokeballs removed, so they can only be bought after getting the Pokédex. I think this restriction is unnecessary and babies the player far too much. Let me catch a Hoppip and watch you get bodied by the rival's starter. I have my starter anyway, and it's not like you actually need to win any of these fights in order to progress. I just think it's an unnecessary restriction that doesn't add anything to the game. I know that the logic for not having Pokeballs is usually that you don't have a Pokédex at that point, but I just don't see that as sufficient justification for blocking access to Pokeballs. It's not like catching another Pokemon is going to let me sequence break the game or anything. Players have been doing that in these games for years without catching any wild Pokemon anyway. The second change is also simple, and would work fine in tandem with my other suggestion. Just give the starters a stab move. My word, Game Freak, was it that hard? Just give the water types Water Gun or Bubble, fire types Ember, grass types Vine Whip or something. Anything to introduce some variation into the fight and actually make it feel like a worthwhile tutorial. Currently, the player learns nothing about the fact that water is weak against grass or grass against fire, because until Generation 6, that only gave the starters normal damaging moves, rather than moves of their own type. If you're going to have an early tutorial fight, you may as well impart some basic mechanical information to the player. I can imagine some people might not like this for one main reason. Depending on whether your starter is weak or strong against your rivals, it would make the fight either too easy or too hard. I just don't see this as an issue, to be honest. Either you get bullied in the fight and learn through loss to take advantage of, or at least be cognizant of type advantages, or you totally smash your rival and can credit that to use of type advantages. Either way, the player learns that type advantages mean something, and can leave the battle with a little more knowledge of battling than when they started. It's also just way more satisfying to use super effective moves than it is to bludgeon your opponent 3 times with Tackle and call it a day. The fact that this change has been implemented is good, but it's a bit shambolic that it took until X and Y to make it happen. And even then they weirdly got rid of it in Sword and Shield. I think that the changes that they've made to the battles themselves are positive, but I also really like the increased scene setting in the later games. Rather than a chance encounter in a lab with someone you'll see again 5 times throughout the game, they actually feel more like a genuine beginning to a story, a start point of a longer, more interesting tale. Granted, early Pokemon games didn't have much of a story or tale to speak of, but the point stands. I also think that it's a bit of a shame that the beginnings of newer Pokemon games are more prescriptive in a way, and I wish there was more of an unhindered exploratory element to starting off your adventure. I like the idea of wandering into some tall grass and getting into trouble, only to be bailed out by a professor or some other main NPC. It gets the ball rolling in a good way. But I can't really fault the newer games for taking a more prescriptive direction, since they are usually actually doing something with it story-wise, and at least in Scarlet and Violet, using it to set up a broader scene, some motifs, some themes, more characters and the like. Not that I really play Pokemon for the writing, but if they're going to do a lot more story stuff, I'd like it to be done well. Maybe they can go a little overboard with setting things up time-wise. Sun and Moon's Tutorial Island certainly did enough to turn a lot of players off those games. My preference would be for a short, sharp 10-minute intro that introduces a bit of the lore and the world before I can get into some actual gameplay. There is a balance to be struck here, and there's some element of personal preference on whether people would like more story or more gameplay up front, but it's not like they can't introduce content later on as well. And that's all I had. Did you enjoy these fights? Do you agree that they've gotten better over time with stab moves and scene setting for the rest of the game? Let me know in the comments below, I'd love to hear people's thoughts. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, it helps the channel out a bunch. Give me a follow on Twitch if you want to chat between videos and see some speedruns. Thanks for watching.